This video will cover the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement. I'm Nicholas, and this is the Law Enforcement Agency Information Channel. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement, or FWS DRLE for short, not to be mistaken with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement, is a civilian staffed uniformed United States federal law enforcement agency that falls under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or FWS for short, which falls under the U.S. Department of the Interior, or DOI for short. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement is responsible for protecting the resources, wildlife, employees, and visitors of the approximately 565 I believe, the 565, approximately 565 national wildlife refuge sites throughout the U.S. Their officers enforce federal laws, particularly ones regarding fish and wildlife. However, with that being said, they can enforce any as a uniform federal law enforcement agency. They can enforce any federal law they witness directly violated. However, like as I mentioned in the beginning, they primarily focus on enforcing federal laws that regard fish and wildlife, such as the Lassie Act, and much more. It's important to note that someone who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement is known as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife officer, or a federal Fish and Wildlife officer. If you said either of which, you'd be correct. Specific duties of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement include, patrolling, policing, and protecting national wildlife refuge sites throughout the U.S. Protecting endangered wildlife through the enforcement of federal laws. Investigating federal crimes that take place on national wildlife refuge sites. Educating visitors, including children and adults, about the history of national wildlife refuge sites, and applicable rules and federal laws, much more. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement currently has approximately 230 employees, the majority of which being active law enforcement personnel. It's pretty small compared to other law enforcement agencies within the Department of the Interior. It's not bad. That's really it for its responsibilities. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement reports to the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who reports to the Secretary of the Interior, who reports to the President of the United States, or POTUS for short. U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers, just like nearly all federal officers, have authority to carry firearms, make arrests, and issue warrants. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement has domestic-wide jurisdiction throughout the United States and its individual territories to protect national wildlife refuge sites. U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers train alongside Bureau of Land Management police officers for approximately 15 to 20 weeks, usually 18 weeks. But yeah, at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is a uniformed agency that focuses on protecting national wildlife refuge sites and investigating federal crimes, any federal crime that takes place on a national federal that takes place on a national wildlife refuge site. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement, on the other hand, is a investigative agency that solely focuses on investigating federal crimes that explicitly regard fish and wildlife anywhere within the U.S. They don't really care whether it takes place within a national wildlife refuge. They don't care whether it takes place within a national wildlife refuge site, whereas the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Refuge Law Enforcement does. So the main difference here is their responsibilities and function. Yes, U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers do have the right to pursue you for a crime committed within a national wildlife refuge site. In general, these are normal fresh pursuit powers for law enforcement. But since U.S. Fish and Wildlife since U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers are federal law enforcement officers, they already have domestic-wide jurisdiction, which is the biggest jurisdiction in the U.S. So therefore, they don't need fresh pursuit powers in order to pursue someone because they already meet the limit to jurisdiction within the U.S. But it does help, though. I mean, yeah, in a way, to an extent, as many people would say. But it also fresh pursuit powers only extend to a state. The jurisdiction of federal law enforcement extends to the entire country. So yeah, they definitely don't really need fresh pursuit powers. But aside from that, for example, I'll give you a hypothetical example of basically what they could pursue you for. And yeah, so for example, hypothetically, let's say you're strolling along in a national wildlife refuge site when you spot, let's say, this small little lizard, and you want to keep it and bring it home. So you check around, you don't see any people around you, and you put the lizard in your backpack, and then you go, you hit the road, and you take your car on the road. Little do you know, a U.S. Fish and Wildlife officer spotted you taking that lizard and putting it in your backpack and going away. So he calls another unit on you. Miles away, once you're like 10 minutes later, you're like a couple miles away from the national wildlife refuge site that you took that lizard at, and you notice a federal fish and wildlife officer, a federal fish and wildlife officer's truck with its emergency lights on, and he's coming straight towards you. Now, he pulls you over, and the average, in reality, the average guy who thinks he's smart would say, "Don't you have? Isn't this outside your jurisdiction?" And because I've heard of that many times, and people say it a lot, and in reality, if you say that, you're actually wrong because U.S. Fish and Wildlife officers do have domestic-wide jurisdiction since they're federal law enforcement, as I mentioned before, and they especially have domestic-wide jurisdiction if you commit a crime within a national wildlife refuge site. So yeah. So to answer and to answer this common question, yes, they can pursue you for as long as they need to throughout the U.S.